G'day guys, it's Tim here. We're just getting set up for our Perth event tonight. It's going to be a cracker of an event. We've probably got over 100 people going to be here tonight. And last night I was in Melbourne, one of our biggest events in Melbourne actually last night. So a really great night, but basically wanted to get on the Facebook Live. Earlier in the week we sent out a video just letting people know if they had any questions that they wanted me to address or answer, to either send us messages or to comment or to tweet, you know, all the different social channels, right? So we got a stack of response. I actually got a couple of questions all in the same realm, so I thought that probably what I'd do is really address that one. Probably a complicated answer as well, so it might take a little bit of time, and I don't know if I'll get too much chance to answer the other questions, but of course, if I didn't answer your questions, don't worry, we will get back to you and get those questions answered for you. So the question that I really wanted to deal with today was in relation to the Perth market. So I had a couple of people from the East Coast message me saying that they were interested in investing in the Perth market and what did I think of the Perth market, or what did I think about their decision to look at investing in the Perth market. I also had some people probably from the other end of the spectrum as well who were maybe not so positive about the Perth market and wanted to think about what my thoughts were and what the kind of market forces were at play over here in Perth. So I thought I'd address that. Now, of course, when we're looking at economic cycles and the way that these affect, particularly when it comes to property, we're going to be looking at things from two different perspectives. So you can, well, in actual fact, there's three. You can look at them from a macro, which means like a large perspective, overall perspective. You could look at them from what they call mesoeconomics, which is more from a mid-level range, and then you've also got the more microeconomics. So I'm going to try and keep it broad, but as detailed as possible at the same time. So first, let's talk about where the Perth market currently is. So the Perth market has seen approximately 2 years in the downturn phase of its cycle. The primary reason for this was the mining and resources boom that we saw in Perth, running for quite a few years, obviously, prior to that. Now, one of the big factors that led to there's probably a couple of factors that has led to Perth being in probably a more pronounced downturn than what we would normally see in a cycle. Primarily, the mining and resources boom caused a huge construction phase here. Now, with all the projects, these projects being constructed, it takes a lot more people to construct a project than it does to operate that project once it's been built. So there was a increased level of demand in terms of there were all these jobs that were required. All the big mining companies were paying huge incomes for people to work FIFO because they needed the workforce. What that led to is obviously an increased demand in the Perth area. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we saw Perth run a lot longer than it would in its original upturn cycle, and then when that switched, okay, and we saw firstly one of the demand drop because people started to move out of Perth. That was one of the major factors that obviously led us into the downturn that we're currently in. Now, despite what a lot of people also think, we don't have a negative population growth here in WA. In fact, our population growth, and I don't have the stats directly on hand, but I think is around 1.4% per annum, which is still actually quite a solid population growth. The other thing that had led to depressed prices as well is because of the upturn that we had, and this is typically how the property cycles move, is that when things are really good, well, it's profitable for developers to develop. So you see these developers going out, securing obviously blocks of land, subdividing, developing, building apartments. That then causes an oversupply of product onto the market. Of course, basic economics, demand, supply, that's also going to lead to a reduced demand, which is obviously going to have a downward pressure on property prices as well. The simple fact of the matter, and if we start to talk more long term, so not necessarily about where Perth has been or where it currently is, but the thing that we've got to look at, and probably the most telling thing, is the report the ABS released not that long ago was about Australia's population growth, 40 million people in the next 40 years. The biggest thing to come out of that report is that over the next 40 years, the state or the city that is going to see the largest amount of population growth is going to be Western Australia, and Perth more in particular. It's going to more than double in population, which is much greater population growth than what we're going to see in Melbourne, and much greater population growth than what we're going to see in Sydney. So primarily this is what's going to push the housing market and cycle, okay? Some other factors that come probably more into the micro side of things. In Perth, we have the most sparsely populated city in the world, means that we have the least amount of people spread out over the most amount of area. This has a major impact on the supply and the ability of the government to provide transport and infrastructure to the people living in a house. So what it does is seriously reduces the level of supply that can come to the market. So population growth is going to provide the demand. And then we're also going to have severe restrictions on supply just because of how our city is planned out. So that's why we've started to see Perth turn the corner, okay? That's why I also started to get those messages from people who are now actually starting to consider. I mean, when you look in Sydney, the median house price in Sydney, I'm talking houses over $1 million. Median house price in Melbourne is about $750,000. So what you're starting to see, and we've seen these markets start to taper off in the last probably 3 to 6 months. So what's happening is investors are now actually starting to look at moving their money from places like Sydney and Melbourne into the Perth market, because obviously the Perth market is kind of at the bottom of its cycle, which of course is the best time to buy. The other thing that I haven't really talked about too much is also the availability of finance, because this also has a huge impact on demand as well. If people want to buy but they can't get access to finance, then they're unable to buy. So that's obviously reduces the amount of demand available as well. Perth has also got caught up in the fact that while the Melbourne and Sydney markets have been quite overheated and quite hot for the last probably year or two, what this has led APRA to do, which is the body that regulates finance here in Australia, what they've been doing is they've been putting the clamps on banks giving out finance. So of course that has been done to slow down the Melbourne and Sydney markets, but of course you've got quite a slow market going on over here in Perth, which has also caused that to happen as well. Have no fear though, we're going to start to see this turn around. Now that Melbourne and Sydney are coming off, we're already starting to see lenders look at ways that they can provide more competitive products into the market. This is also probably another indicator that we can look at as well as what's happening in the US. Typically the US, what happens in the US markets is normally around about 18 to 24 months in front of what happens in the Australian markets. And we've seen a turn in the credit cycle, okay, in terms of the US. We're going to start to see that flow through here into Australia as well. Now that Melbourne and Sydney have slowed down, it's certainly going to reduce the concerns that APRA and the Federal Reserve Bank have, and we'll start to see more available credit. A lot of detail. I hope I answered your questions. So, look, I hope that gave you some insight. If I didn't get your questions answered, of course, please let us know. Please either comment down the bottom, send us the messages as you guys always do. Of course, I know people had lots of other questions out there as well. So, if there's anything that you want me to deal with, ask. Sometimes people want to know things about some personal mindset stuff, what are the hardest things that I've had to deal with, or that kind of stuff. So whether you want to ask me technical questions about finance or markets or particular assets or investing, or whether you want to talk to me more on a mindset level, I'm more than happy to spend my time giving as much value to you guys as well. We just love the response that we've been getting. But anyway, I better get back to it. Got to get ready, probably on stage in about an hour or so. Have a great day, guys. Love to hear your questions, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.